Our next session is from Dr. Hilary Clayton. I'm sure you're all familiar with her work. Dr. Clayton is a leading specialist in biomechanics, and I'm sure if you've done any kind of studies, you will have referenced her work just along with Sue's as well. Now, this is a really interesting presentation. Due to Dr. Clayton's internet, she was concerned that she might dip in and out. She's pre-recorded, but she will be appearing in around 45 minutes time to answer your questions. So please feel free to stick your questions in the chat as we are going, just like with all the other talks. And I will get rid of myself out of this box and we will hit go on this one. Right. Mary, could you get this to play for me?
Clayton, and I'm going to be talking to you today about... Hello, I'm Hilary Clayton, and I'm going to be talking to you today about how the hoof interacts with the ground and how different surface types can affect that interaction. So thinking about locomotion, it's really an essential part of life for all animals. It's necessary to enable them to find food, to find a mate and reproduce, and also to escape predators. There are lots of different methods of locomotion. The thing that they have in common is that they all require the animal or the bird or the fish to apply an external force against the environment, and that's how the movement is generated. So if we look at the pictures from left to right, on the left we have a photograph of running, and in this case the feet are going to push against the ground to generate the forces necessary for locomotion. In the second picture we see an animal brachiating, which means swinging from its arms, usually swinging through the trees, and in this case the hands are exerting a force against this log in order to move through the environment. Now, in the case of swimming, the environment is not air, but water. So fish have fins and a tail fin that they can use to generate forces against the water to create locomotion. And here's a little hummingbird. He's again moving through air as the environment and flapping his wings to generate forces against the air. So from now on, we're going to talk about legged locomotion, which means locomotion using legs to create forces against the environment. So the way it works is that on the left, we have a horse with the central nervous system consisting of the brain and the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, which is the nerves that come out from the spinal cord, and we're going to be particularly concerned with the innervation of the forelimb and the hind limb. And the motor nerves stimulate the muscles. The muscular contractions are going to move the bones at the joints. And then, as a result of that, the hooves are going to press against the ground, and that's how the horse generates ground reaction forces. During every stride, each limb has a stance phase and a swing phase. During the stance phase, the limb is stationary on the ground, and the horse's body is passing forward over that grounded limb. And then when the hoof is raised from the ground at the start of the swing phase, then the limb accelerates forward, limb is protracted and reaches ahead of the body before it's placed on the ground at the start of the next stance phase. So during the swing phase, the forces that are exerted on the limb are relatively small. And it's during the stance phase that the limb is pushing against the ground to generate the ground reaction forces. And these GRFs, that's the shortened form of ground reaction force, these GRFs can be very large. They need to be large in order to propel the mass of the horse. But also we have to realize that those ground reaction forces are also responsible for a majority of musculoskeletal injuries in the horse. Now, when we watch a horse in motion, we can see the movements of the horse's body. So we can see the kinematics, which are the movements. What we can't see are the forces. Forces are invisible to our eye. And as I said with the last slide, it's these forces that are potentially damaging to the limbs. So the more we can learn about these forces, the better we can understand injuries. So we're going to spend a little bit of time just looking at the normal ground reaction force during the stance phase of the stride. And we measure these ground reaction forces using a force plate, which is a rectangular metallic plate embedded in the ground. And you can see the edges of the force plate in this photograph. So when the hoof pushes against the ground, it generates a force that acts into the ground, and that's represented here by the purple arrow. So forces are what we call vectors, in that they not only have a magnitude or a size, they also act in a very specific direction. And we know that intuitively. If you take your hand and push against the table, it has a different effect than if you exert that same force on the table, but you pull it towards you. So the pushing and pulling actions both exert a force, but they exert the force in different directions, so they have a different effect. So we can represent a force by an arrow. And this arrow has certain characteristics. The length of the arrow is proportional to the size of the force. The direction in which the arrow acts, here it's acting forwards and downwards into the ground. The direction indicates the direction of the force. And then the point at which the arrow starts is what we might call the center of pressure, or the point of force application. Now, when the hoof exerts a force against the ground also exerts a force back against the horse's limb. And that force can also be represented by an arrow. The arrow is the same length as the force pushing into the ground. It acts in exactly the opposite direction, and it has the same point of application. So that's really just Sir Isaac Newton's third law of motion. For every force, there's an equal and opposite force acting in the opposite direction. Now, for purposes of analysis, we can take this ground reaction force vector and divide it into its component forces. And we choose to look at the vertical component, which is acting obviously vertically, and it acts to oppose the effects of gravity. And also this is the force that will project the horse into the air, for example, during jumping. Then we have a longitudinal force component that's acting from front to back along the horse's body. And this component is responsible for speed, for acceleration and deceleration. And then the third component is the transverse force, which acts from side to side across the horse's body. And this is the one that's going to provide the force that will cause the horse to turn or to make lateral movements. So you'll notice that these three forces are all perpendicular to each other. Now, when I do my analysis in the lab, I use a motion capture system in which we apply reflective markers to the horse's body, as you can see on the photo on the left. And these markers are applied over specific anatomical landmarks. Many of those are the centers of rotation of the joints. And then we tell the computer which marker to connect to which other markers to make a stick figure. And then when we record the horse moving along our runway, we can actually see the stick figure in motion. And that's what we have in this diagram on the right. So here we see the stick figure for a horse's forelimb, the yellow rectangle that the limb steps on, that's a force plate. And when the limb is in contact with the force plate, you see a red line that represents the ground reaction force vector. And one of the things to notice here is that in the beginning, that vector is pointing a little bit to the left of the screen, which is towards the horse's tail. And as the horse's weight rolls over that grounded hoof, the force vector changes its angulation and it ends up pointing towards the right, towards the head of the horse. And that's the normal pattern for the ground reaction force vector in any of the limbs. Now, what I'm showing on this diagram is a graph of the vertical in blue and the longitudinal in pink ground reaction forces throughout one complete stance phase. So time 0 here represents contact of the hoof with the ground, and time 100, that's the end of the stance phase, that's when the hoof leaves the ground and goes off into the next swing phase. And above here I have the stick figures that correspond with the graph below, and these are shown at 20% intervals of the stance phase. So at 0, 20, 40, 60, 80, and 100% of the stance phase. And then with the white stick figures, in green, I'm showing the ground reaction force vector that corresponds with that stick figure. So, what do we see? Well, we see that the vertical ground reaction force has a little bit of wiggling in the beginning, and then it goes up smoothly, peaks in around the middle of the stance phase, and then decreases again. And it's by far the largest magnitude of any of the GRF components. And then down here in pink we have the longitudinal force. Now, it's very different in shape from the vertical force. It starts off with a little bit of wiggling, and then it has a negative value until around the middle of the stance phase, after which it has a positive value. And the negative and positive parts of the longitudinal force curve correspond with the direction of the force vector arrows. So in the early part of the stance phase, the force vector is angled a little bit towards the horse's tail, and that corresponds with the negative phase on the graph here. And then later in the stance phase, when the force vector is pointing forwards a little bit towards the horse's head, then that corresponds with the positive part of the longitudinal force trace. Okay, so this sort of puts together the limb orientation, the force vector orientation, and the values of the component parts. So it's the magnitude of the vertical force that really has the biggest influence on the length of the force vectors. So the longest force vector would be around the middle of the stance phase, and it would be vertical at that point when the longitudinal force is crossing 0. And the longitudinal force is responsible for determining the direction of the force vector. So a negative longitudinal force, the vector points backwards, and the effect is to decelerate or slow the forward movement. And then in the second half of the stance phase, when we have a positive longitudinal force, the force vector is pointing forward towards the horse's head, and the effect is to accelerate the horse's body forwards. So let's have a look now at another little stick figure. This time we've got a horse trotting over a series of 4 force plates. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4. You can see they're outlined in different colors, and they're set at an appropriate distance that the horse will have a hind hoof and a front hoof on different force plates. So we can see the hind and the front force vectors at the same time. And you'll notice that the magnitude of the force, the length of the force vector, is always larger in the forelimb than the hind limb. And that's because the forelimb is carrying a larger percentage of the body weight. Overall, about 58% of the weight is carried by the forelimbs. And you can also see how the direction of the force vector changes here, from pointing backwards and then rotating gradually until it points forwards towards the end of the stance phase. The line that we see here is tracking the horse's center of mass. You can see that goes up and down. It goes up in the suspension phases and comes down in the diagonal stance phases. Now this is a diagram of the different phases of the stance phase that we're going to look at. We're going to take a look at the impact phase, the loading phase, and then the propulsion phase. Now when you look at this illustration, it looks as if the impact phase is very, very long because I've got 3 diagrams there. But in fact, it's extremely short. It only takes about 50 to 60 milliseconds, so very short period of time. But what happens during that time is that the hoof, as it approaches the ground, it's moving with a forward and downward velocity. And then when the hoof contacts the ground, the hardness of the ground first of all stops the downward motion. So it exerts a force against the hoof that stops that downward velocity. And then the frictional resistance of the ground acts against the direction that the hoof is trying to slide forward, and that stops the horizontal velocity. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. During that initial impact phase, it's simply the weight of the hoof and the distal limb that's involved. It's not until a little bit later that the hoof is loaded by the entire weight of the horse. And as I said on the last slide, the hoof is moving forward and downward as it approaches the ground, and then after it contacts the ground, it's very rapidly decelerated to 0 velocity. And that deceleration initiates a shock wave that causes concussion on the bones and joints. So this impact phase, when the hoof just contacts the ground and gets decelerated, that's potentially an injurious phase for the bones and the joints, the hard tissues of the limb. And here on the same graph that we saw before, you can see that the impact phase is just this short phase at the beginning of stance, and it's the phase when we have this sort of wobbling effect in both the vertical and more especially in the longitudinal forces that represents that rapid deceleration of the hoof. Now this is a still photo, I'm going to show you the video in a moment, of a thoroughbred with the limb approaching the ground and then contacting the ground. And we have a marker on the horse's coronet. So each of these little red, actually diamonds, represents the position of the horse's coronet in one frame of this video. And you can see that as the leg is coming down towards the ground, it's moving forwards and downwards. And then the hoof hits the ground and it stops moving downwards. So the downward velocity is stopped first, but then the hoof continues to slide forward a little ways as the horizontal velocity is decreased. And then just at the end here where you see this little curve, that's when the toe of the foot rotates into the footing. So here we go with the video. This is from a motion analysis system. Just putting that marker on the coronet, and then we're going to trace that marker as the hoof approaches the ground, contacts the ground, stops, slides forward. There you see the fetlock extending and the hoof starting to rotate so the toe digs into the ground. So during the impact phase, we have concussion on the limbs, and that concussion, because of the magnitude and the rapid vibration frequency in particular, it's potentially damaging to the bones and the joints, and especially to the joints in the distal part of the limb. But then on the other hand, the horse needs some concussion in order to maintain the musculoskeletal system and to increase the strength of its tissues during the conditioning process. So it's a very delicate balance between providing enough of a stimulus to get the horse really fit, well conditioned and strong, versus providing too much of a stimulus and ending up with damage to the tissues, micro damage that can then progress to major damage. And I have two examples of that down here. On the left is a thoroughbred forelimb with multiple comminuted fractures in the fetlock region. And most of the fractures in thoroughbred horses are preceded by some kind of micro damage, fatigue damage. And then the other photo here is a sport horse with a huge ring bone and the proximal interphalangeal joint. And you can see from the extent of that new bone and the way it crosses the joint that it is going to completely ankylose that joint. So as I said, we have a very delicate balance between stimulating adaptation of the tissues versus causing injury. Now the horse has certain inbuilt mechanisms for absorbing concussion. So the concussion is generated between the hoof and the ground, and the first line of defense is within the hoof. And there is a hemodynamic mechanism within the hoof whereby through the expansion of the heels, the blood is sucked through the lateral cartilages, and as the blood is going through the feet, it's acting to actually absorb the shock in this hemodynamic mechanism. We also have certain structures that are very good at absorbing shock. If we look at each of the joints, you can see the articular cartilage as a white layer on the end of each bone. Articular cartilage is a very good shock absorber, but as this longitudinal section shows, it's only present in rather a thin layer, so that kind of limits how much it can do to absorb or dissipate the concussion. But underneath the articular cartilage is the subchondral bone, and that also is rather a good shock absorber. And then another thing that helps absorb concussion is the flexion of the joints during weight bearing. So the hoof actually absorbs a lot of the concussion, and as we go proximally from the hoof, we're getting a sort of cumulative effect of absorbing the concussion. So it's the most distal bones and joints in the limb that are most susceptible to concussive injuries during the impact phase. And that would be particularly arthritic type changes. Now, it's not only the horse that can play a role in the absorption of concussion. The footing is also important, and the composition and the material properties of the footing affect how it responds to contact with the horse's hoof. So in relation specifically to concussion, the properties that are going to determine the effect are, first of all, the hardness of the footing, because the hardness is what determines the rate of vertical deceleration, and then the sliding shear resistance. So the resistance of the surface to having the hoof slide across it or through it is what determines the horizontal deceleration. And this property, we sometimes just refer to it as sliding, or the grip that's offered by the surface, the grip or grippiness. So let's just look at those two properties. First of all, hardness. So hardness is the resistance of the surface to being penetrated by the hoof. So a hard surface does not allow the hoof to sink into it, and this means that it stops that downward vertical motion very abruptly. So a hard surface is associated with high concussion, and high concussion is a risk factor for arthritic injuries. Soft surfaces, on the other hand, have a much lower resistance, and these surfaces will allow the hoof to sink into the footing material, as you can see in this photograph of a horse on a soft, deep sand. So when the hoof is sinking into the footing, it's being decelerated much more slowly, and that reduces concussion. But there's always some kind of a trade-off, and the problem with these soft, deep footings is that the muscles have to work a lot harder to generate propulsion, because the surface tends to give way as the hoof pushes against it to propel the horse forward. So there tends to be an earlier onset of fatigue with these soft surfaces, and also that brings a greater risk of injury to the soft tissues, such as ligaments and tendons. The other property of the surface that affects the impact is the shear resistance, and specifically the shear resistance to sliding of the hoof. So on a firm surface, like on a road, the hoof slides along on top of the surface. And under those conditions, the sliding is limited by the friction between the two surfaces. And the friction is dependent on the coefficient of friction, which is specific for the two surfaces, which might be, picture on the right, the horn of the hoof and the cement, or in the picture on the left, the steel shoe with the black top. Okay, so it's a highly specific measurement. And I think we know sort of intuitively that a horse shod with metal shoes is more likely to slip on the road than a barefoot horse, because of this difference in the coefficient of friction. We have a higher coefficient with the horn of the hoof versus the metal of the shoe. Now, when we have horses working in a granular surface, and a granular surface would include sand, most of the surfaces that we actually work the horse on are granular. And on these surfaces, the hoof is able to penetrate a short way into the surface as that surface is absorbing the vertical motion. So then when the hoof is partly embedded in the surface, it's not just sliding across the top of the footing, it actually has to plow through the footing. So we have to take into account not only the friction between the hoof and the surface, but also the friction between the particles within the surface. So it becomes a little bit more difficult to calculate. We don't really have good ways to calculate this. But one of the clues that the foot is sliding through the surface is when you see this sand being pushed up in a little wave in front of the hoof. That indicates that the hoof is sliding through the sand and pushing the sand ahead of it. So when the sliding resistance is low, it allows the hoof to slide too far. And these horses would not be able to race on an ice surface without having some corks or studs in their shoes. The horse's natural response to a surface that allows too much sliding is to shorten the stride, shorten the protraction and retraction, so that the limb, the body is more over the limb, if you like. There's less range of motion away from the vertical position of the limb, and that reduces the risk of slipping. Now, if we go to the other extreme and look at sliding shear resistance that's too high, then that stops the hoof very abruptly, and this contributes to the concussive effect. And one of the things that we have to be just a little bit concerned about on our synthetic surfaces, and that's the surfaces that have sand and fibers, and sometimes they have wax in them, those surfaces tend to offer more grip. And more grip means that they stop the hoof more rapidly than if the horse was just working on simple dirt or sand. So we've looked at the impact phase. Let's move ahead now and look at the main weight-bearing phase of the stride. So this is the phase when the limb is going to be loaded by the weight of the horse. And on our graph showing the vertical and longitudinal forces, the loading phase would be the phase within this box here. So it goes from the end of the impact phase to the start of breakover in this diagram. So the hoof is on the ground, the limb is rotating from a protracted position to a more retracted position, and the horse's body weight is passing over the hoof as the limb rotates. Weight bearing is maximum in the middle part of the stance phase, so around about here, and that pretty much corresponds with the time when the forelimb is vertical. And if we were to follow this line up, we would see that it would go through the proximal part of the scapula, which is the center of rotation for the forelimb. And at this point, the fetlock is maximally extended. Now, in the gaits that have a suspension phase, the fetlock and its supporting structures are acting like a spring. So the flexor tendons and the suspensory ligament are storing energy as the fetlock joint extends, and then as the weight passes forward over the limb and the fetlock joint starts to rise and flex again, then that stored energy is released and helps to propel the horse forward. So fetlock is provided by a combination of tension in the superficial flexor tendon, the deep flexor tendon, and the suspensory ligament. And the load is distributed between those three structures. If one of those is unloaded, for example, in the photo on the right here, we've got a horse with a heel wedge. That heel wedge is going to change the angle of particularly the coffin joint in such a way that it partly unloads the deep digital flexor tendon. And that's something you might use in a horse with a strained deep flexor. But the thing we have to realize, and the point I really want to make here, is that forces just don't go away. They get redistributed elsewhere. So if we reduce the force on the deep flexor tendon, then we're going to increase the force on the superficial flexor and or the suspensory ligament. Now, horses have, and all animals have, different types of tendons. One type of tendon I'm going to call positional tendons. And these are tendons that are highly fibrous, they're not elastic, they don't stretch when they're subjected to a tensile force, so they're constant length. So these tendons will transmit changes in length of the muscle very precisely. So if you want to do something like play the piano, you use the muscles in your hands and arms to move your fingers, and the positional tendons will place your fingers on the keys exactly as you want them to. The other type of tendons we'll call elastic tendons. And these tendons differ in having a large component of elastic tissue. So when these tendons have a tensile force applied to them, they stretch. As they stretch, they store elastic energy. And when the tensile force is released, then these tendons recoil, release the elastic energy, and that can be harnessed in locomotion to provide an energy-saving mechanism. So elastic tendons are primarily used during locomotion to save energy. Now, in the distal limbs of the horse, we have both positional tendons and elastic tendons. The positional tendons are the deep digital flexor and the extensor tendons, and those are shown in the diagram here in blue, the deep flexor and the extensor tendons. And it's not a coincidence that this pair of tendons are on the opposite side of the leg. They're acting antagonistically to control hoof placement. They don't store energy, and it's also not a coincidence that these tendons are seldom injured by repetitive strain injury. Any tendon can be injured by trauma and so on, but these ones tend not to be injured by repetitive loading. So here's an example of a horse at the trot, and if you watch the position of the hoof as it swings forward and approaches the ground, you'll see that the toe of the foot sometimes flips up and then flips down again in preparation for landing. Those movements are being controlled by those antagonistic deep flexor and extensor tendons. See how close that horse moves as he brings the hind limbs forward. Now, in addition to having positional tendons, the horse's distal limbs also have elastic tendons. And these ones are shown in pink on the diagram. On the back of the limb here, we've got the superficial digital flexor tendon, and then further forward adjacent to the cannon bone is the suspensory ligament. And these structures store elastic energy during locomotion. They are also susceptible to repetitive strain injury, which is a feature of elastic type tendons. So elastic tendons are characterized by being mostly developed during the early months and years of life. So by the time a foal is about 2 years old, most of the conditioning of the elastic tendons has already taken place. After 2 years, they have a very limited response to conditioning, and we can't make up for lack of turnout in a young horse by conditioning later on in life. And both tendons and pulled suspensories are classified as repetitive use injuries. And that means that they're associated with multiple cycles of loading and unloading during locomotion. And there's actually an inverse relationship between the magnitude of loading, and that determines the amount of stretching, of course, and the number of loading cycles. So the higher the loading, the fewer the number of cycles that are required in order to cause injury. And risk factors that make injury more likely include the speed of locomotion, the body weight of the horse, and the type of farriery and footing that the horse is working on. There's also another feature of the elastic tendons that's important, and that is that they tend to accumulate damage throughout the life of the horse. So older horses become more susceptible to repetitive strain injury of the elastic tendons because these tendons are weaker in older horses. And studies in thoroughbred racehorses have shown that horses over 11 years old have a superficial digital flexor tendon that's about 40% weaker than in a younger horse. And the injury to these elastic structures in horses is very similar to Achilles tendon damage in people. The Achilles tendon is also an elastic tendon. But what this fact tells us is that we should be particularly careful with our older horses. Make sure that owners and trainers are paying attention to these structures, palpating them daily, maybe icing the horse after work, and taking care not to overtrain older horses. I said that surface was one of the things that affects loading in mid-stance. And here we're concerned with two features of the footing, the cush or cushioning. And this is what provides damping, and the effect of damping is to lower the peak vertical force on the limb. The other feature of the footing that's important is the elasticity, also sometimes called the rebound. And the rebound effect occurs when the surface, just like the tendons in the horse's leg actually, when it's deformed by the horse, it stores elastic energy and then springs back a little bit to release some of that energy to help bounce the horse's leg off the ground. We tend not to work with very elastic surfaces in horses. Some of our surfaces have a little bit of elasticity, which is very nice, but mostly here we're talking about the cushioning. So cushioning is very well shown by this mat. This is a high jumper, and they land on very soft mats to reduce the risk of injury. And so a cushy surface is dampening the force on landing. So the process of damping involves displacing the footing or deforming the particles of the footing. So the effect of damping is to leave a hoof print in the ground after the horse has passed by. So, you can look at the hoof prints to get an idea of how much cushioning or damping is going to be allowed by the surface. It's expressed mechanically as the percentage of reduction of the maximal force compared with moving on concrete. And if we take a horse that's moving on concrete on the left here, you can see that there is no sinking in, there's no hoof print left after the horse passes over it. Whereas on the type of surfaces that we use for equestrian sports, we do usually get some imprint of the hoof. This is a horse moving over a synthetic surface, and you can see that there's a nice hoof print left after the horse passes by. So that's a good thing. Now, moving on to the final part of the stance phase, I'm going to talk about the breakover phase, which is towards the end of the propulsion phase. So during breakover, the coffin joint is flexing as the hoof rotates around the toe. Now, if the horse is on a hard surface, the toe will maintain contact with the ground and the heels will leave the ground. On our graph, breakover is the terminal part, and if you look here, you can see a little change in the longitudinal force. That place where the shape changes, that marks the start of breakover. And if you look really carefully, you can see a point in the vertical force curve where there's a tiny inflection. So what happens at the end of the stance phase is that as the horse's body is passing forward over the limb is being retracted, the angle is changing, and at that time we have increasing tension in the deep digital flexor tendon, which is going around behind the navicular bone and then attaching to the undersurface of the coffin bone. And the fact that it goes around the navicular bone changes the direction of the force that's applied. So the force applied by that deep flexor tendon is acting mostly in a caudal direction. It's trying to flex the coffin joint. But the coffin joint is prevented from flexing by the resistance that's provided to the front of the foot by the ground. So this is the effect of the ground reaction force. And as we get closer and closer to the end of the stance phase, the ground reaction force is progressively decreasing, while the force of the deep digital flexor tendon is progressively increasing. And there comes a point where these forces equilibrate, and then the force of the deep flexor tendon exceeds the resistance of the ground reaction force, and that's the moment when the heels lift off the ground, breakover starts, and the coffin joint is going to begin to flex. Now, the important thing here from an injury standpoint is that it's just before the heels lift from the ground that we have maximum tension in this deep flexor tendon, and that's also creating a compressive force against the navicular bone and the navicular bursa. So we have very high forces in the palmar part of the foot towards the end of the stance phase. And as soon as breakover begins, those forces are reduced. So particularly if you have a horse that has navicular type problems or palmar heel pain, anything we can do to ease the start of breakover is going to help that horse. So one thing would be to have the horse over here on the right working on a softer surface, a surface that would allow the toe to penetrate into the surface, because then that reduces the amount of extension of the coffin joint and so takes some of the pressure off the palmar foot structures. Other things we can do are to change the hoof trimming or the shoeing. So here we've got a hoof that's been rounded off at the toe. You can see from this pen that the toe does not extend all the way forwards as it normally would. It's been rounded off and pulled back a little bit, and here's the same sort of appearance seen from underneath. We can also make those changes with the shoe, and here are various shoes that are going to facilitate the rolling forwards and the initiation of breakover. And there are several types of shoes that will do that. Now, the effects of surface depend on the rotational shear resistance, which is a little bit different than the sliding shear resistance that we looked at before. The rotational shear resistance is what determines the penetration of part of the foot into the ground. So if the toe goes in, then the heel is relatively raised, or it might be if the horse is going sideways that the medial or lateral side of the hoof is able to penetrate into the footing. And ideally, we like it if the toe can penetrate into the footing as the leg is pushing off and developing propulsion. We like that because it lowers the forces in the check ligament, the deep flexor tendon, and it lowers the pressure on the navicular bone and bursa. But we need sufficient shear resistance that the footing does not just give way as the hoof tries to push off, because that leads to early onset of fatigue. So this is just illustrating at the top surface with high rotational shear resistance, the toe can't dig in at all. If we have moderate rotational shear resistance, the toe digs in and then the hoof is able to push off against the ground. On a surface like very soft, deep, dry sand, the toe can dig in very nicely, but then the sand doesn't give enough resistance. It just kind of gives way as the hoof pushes off against it. So moderate shear resistance is what we really want from a surface. And here we can see a thoroughbred running on the track. And these little puffs of footing material, we call that kickback or cupping, and that's when the footing is kicked up behind the hoof as it pushes off, and it's a sign of low shear resistance. So just in conclusion, the impact phase, when the hoof is being decelerated, that's the phase when we have a lot of concussion and the hoof, the limb is at risk of concussive type injuries, which would be primarily osteoarthritis. Mid-stance is when we have loading of the soft tissues, especially the flexor tendons and the suspensories, and the more the fetlock hyperextends, then the greater the stretching of those tissues and the fewer loading cycles it takes to induce an injury. The end of the stance phase, the breakover, is when there is most tension in the check ligament and the deep digital flexor tendon, and also there is pressure in the palmar part of the foot, but also at the toe, especially on a hard surface, because you get the wall being pulled away from the laminae. Now, if you're interested in surfaces, these are some free resources. So on the left, the racing surfaces white paper concerns, as it says, racing surfaces. And then the equivalent for sport horses is the equine surfaces white paper. The one on the left, the racing one, is on the Grayson Jockey Club website. The sport surface one is on the FEI website, and then also on the FEI website there's the one on the right, the Equestrian Surfaces Guide, and that's sort of developed from the Equine Surfaces white paper. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Hilary. That was absolutely fantastic, and I think very sensible to pre-record it after you explained how your internet has been behaving. Now, Dr. Clayton is here, I keep on saying the room, with us online on this call. So if anybody would like to ask any questions, we will bring Hilary up and we can chat with her directly. I mean, I thought that was absolutely fascinating. I found the stuff about the impact video, when you really slowed it down, I really loved that. I found that so interesting. And I would love to hear other people's questions and thoughts and comments. That would be great. Let's find Hilary and bring her on the screen. Here we go. And hopefully this will work and she will appear as if by some kind of magic. Well, hopefully Hilary is going to appear at any second flat, but really interesting to hear about the importance of surfaces from another perspective. You know, we've heard from Kate, we've heard from Sue about how we can be doing so much to improve our horses' welfare, keeping them sounder, and how surfaces do have a big role to play. So really great to hear more from a biomechanical perspective as well. Now, do we have any questions that I need to get answered? And I'm hoping I can bring Hilary up on the screen. She is here. I know she's here. Hopefully this will work. Yay! Hi, Hilary. Lovely to see you. I was able to pull you up on the screen. You're just currently muted. Now, is that your garden, or is that the most incredible Zoom backdrop I've seen all day? That looks absolutely stunning. If you just unmute yourself, Hilary, we'll be able to hear you. You're just currently muted. And that's just how I have everybody set to mute. Ah, look what we got. Oh, got some lovely questions coming through as well. So this is a great question, Hilary. The research of 58% of weight being carried through the forelimb. Ah, that's an interesting question. Does that differ with type, like compared to a cob, compared to a thoroughbred, warm blood, and so forth? Hilary, are you struggling to unmute yourself? Let's see what we can do for you. It's like all these things. It's really obvious when it's obvious, and when asked to unmute. Hopefully that should give you an option to unmute yourself. It should just be on the bottom. Do we have sound? Yay!
Can you hear me?
We have sound. Hilary, lovely to see you. Thank you so much. That was a great training session. Really, really interesting. Really enjoyed that. And what a fab question. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that then? So 58% of weight being carried on the forelimb. Is that the same for different types, different breeds? So compared to a chunky cobs or a slightly daintier thoroughbreds and everything in between?
Yeah, we did measure some horses, different conformation types on the force plate, and they were incredibly similar. Now, we haven't measured a lot of horses in motion yet, but it surprised us. We thought the really big chunky ones would have more weight on the forehand, but apparently not.
That's really, really interesting. That's fascinating. So there's a bit of misconception then that all these horses are heavier in front if they are a furry cob, not necessarily then. Really fascinating.
Oh, yeah, I think our world is full of misconceptions.
Oh, yes, and we've been busting plenty of those this morning. This is a great question. Do you think there's more that can be done working with vets in rehabbing injury with appropriate surfaces? I'm very aware of surfaces for, say, navicular, but don't always get so much input from vets on this. So that's really interesting. And that is from an equine podiatrist.
Okay, so yes, we're learning lots and lots more about rehabilitation methods, techniques at the moment. So which surface is appropriate depends on what you're dealing with. You know, with navicular, it's nice if the toe can dig into the surface to reduce the peak forces on the back of the hoof and the navicular region during breakover. Other problems, sometimes soft tissue problems, you want to use a surface and or a shoe that prevent the heel from dipping into the surface lower than the toe, because that would put more strain on the soft tissues down the back of the leg. And something like that, it may just be a matter of adding more water to the surface to make it a bit firmer. But yes, we do need to think about surface types during rehab. And another thing is that the proprioceptive effect is very important. So walking on different types of surfaces, the transition from one surface to another, especially in horses with neurological problems, that's another important thing.
Brilliant, thank you. Some more questions come through for you, Hilary. Is there an ideal surface for all horses at all gaits, at all disciplines? Wow, I don't know the answer to that. Hilary, I'll pass that one to you.
No, and I'm so glad somebody asked that, actually. There is not really one ideal surface. And even if you take, let's say, dressage horses, there's not one surface that's ideal for all dressage movements. So we're always going to be dealing with something that is a little bit imperfect, but as close to sort of universally
good for the sport or the exercise that we're doing. But the thing to recognize about horses is that what horses like is consistency. And they are able to adjust their movement, right? They'll adjust the way that they use the muscles in the limbs according to how they feel the ground underneath their feet. But what's hard for the horses to deal with is ground that keeps on changing. So if you're actually doing sport or moving at speed, then consistency of the ground within a range of properties is what's ideal for the horse. But in addition to that, I do recommend going out and doing work at the walk on all different kinds of terrain and ground.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So, for example, where we are in the UK at the moment, it's just getting muddy everywhere and everything's getting wet and slippy. So the worst thing really would be, you know, a sort of really lovely manicured school and then into something really deep and boggy the next day. And of course, expecting the horse to perform the same. I guess that is...
Well, he won't perform the same. No, we can promise that.
Yes, of course. Another question. How much should riders vary the surfaces that they work on a day-to-day basis?
I think it's very good to vary the surfaces. And if you have, for example, 2 arenas and one of them is a synthetic arena, it's very nice to also have just a sand arena with slightly different properties. Riding on different surfaces, I think, is part of our cross-training that avoids the development of repetitive strain injuries. So yes, do work on different surfaces. But there are also, we have to bear in mind that whatever surface the horse will be competing on, that he should have opportunities to be familiar with that surface.
That's so true. It's so easy to train in an arena and then be competing on grass and be surprised and go to plan. Thank you, Hilary. That's great. Another question. What are your thoughts on breeding dressage horses with natural DAP, diagonal advanced placement?
Well, what that means is that you're breeding uphill horses, and what's not to like about that? I think where we start to get into a little bit of trouble with the current breeding is that some of the horses are just excessively extravagant in their movement. And I like to see a horse that's what I call square in the movement, that matches the amount in front and behind.
Definitely. Any your thoughts, Hilary, on using studs on an artificial surface?
Not sure why you would need studs on an artificial surface if that surface was appropriate for the sport. I think studs are something that occasionally, yes, we need them to avoid injury, but if we don't need them, then we shouldn't use them just in case, because studs, you know, bring their own problems in stopping the forward movement of the hoof rather abruptly.
Yes, definitely. And my husband will tell you they're a pain to put in the first place as well. Oh, that's great. So interesting. So much we can be doing to help our horses. And as I said, I found that slow down video. I found it kind of sort of scary how much the fetlock sunk down. But I know that is kind of part of the horse's design. Was that a horse? I did want to ask you, was it jumping or was it just moving on the flat?
That was the racehorse one, wasn't it?
I think you just said it was a thoroughbred, so yes, potentially.
Okay, yes, it was a thoroughbred racehorse.
Yeah.
So it was traveling at very high speed. So the changes that we saw there, we would see to a lesser extent in our non-racing horses.
Sure. Yeah, no, it was fascinating to just see it that close and that slow. I absolutely loved that. Thank you. Well, I don't think we have any more questions for you, Hilary, but what would be lovely if you could just maybe give us kind of normal riders, everyday riders, you know, what would be your one biggest takeaway that we could put in place to help our horses? I think using lots of surfaces is a brilliant takeaway that everybody can put in place.
My biggest takeaway, and it's sort of on the fringes of what the talk was about, but do use cross training. You know, so many of our injuries are repetitive strain injuries from doing the same type of workout on the same surface day after day after day. So try never to do the same thing 2 days in a row. I mean, sometimes you have to, you're working through an issue and you want to be consistent for a few days. But other than, you know, specific things like that, try to get out on different surfaces, go on the grass when it's good, go on the hills. And it's really good for horses to take the movements that you're training and do them in different places. That's part of their learning process. So, you know, do your little half steps out on the trail or something. That would be my big takeaway.
I love that. That is brilliant. And you have just validated all the training that I'm doing at the moment, which is basically a tiny bit of schooling on hacks. So from a personal note, that's made me feel brilliant and really, really helpful. Because I think particularly for those of us UK based and Europe based, it's hard now this time of year. Like it's just all a bit less appealing. So knowing that actually we can still do plenty on a hack is great to hear. Thank you so much. That has been
You're very welcome.
amazing. Really lovely to see you. Really appreciate your input into today. Thank you so much, Hilary. That was great. We will break for lunch.